I'm Linda Peek-Schacht. I'm the founding director of the Andrews Institute for Civic Leadership at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I am a former chair of what was then the Organizational and Political Communication Department at Emerson College. And for the last 18 years, I have known Dr. Payne, who lured me when I was at the Kennedy School as a senior fellow, thanks to Elaine, lured me to Emerson to spend a wonderful 6 years there working with the students, and has allowed me to come back on a regular basis to either teach or to speak. And I am so happy to be here with all of you to celebrate several things, to celebrate Emerson alums in public diplomacy and politics and polling, in journalism, some of whom are here today, and you'll hear from them on the program, to celebrate the Emerson faculty, and to celebrate this really amazing success of Spencer Kimball and Isabel Holloway and Camille Mumford and others in Emerson polling. They have really put Emerson on the map in that way, and we thank you, Spencer, for doing that. And then finally, to celebrate this fabulous partnership with Blanquerna that has been going on for so long, and that I've been privileged to be associated with as we have had different summits over the years. So thank you for the partnership. And finally, in case he doesn't get acknowledged, I want to acknowledge Shepard Vargo, who put this all together. And it's been a pleasure to be on the organizing team with the people that you see in the program there. Elaine Kamarck and I have been having the conversation we are going to have with you today for 40 years. Elaine is the founding director of the Brookings Center for Effective Public Management. She is also a senior fellow in the governance program there. She's a veteran of 4 presidential campaigns. She is a veteran of the Clinton White House, where she was the architect of the Reinventing Government initiative. She is a scholar and a practitioner. She has written several books, including the one on primaries that is considered the definitive book on American primaries. And she's written a book called Why Presidents Fail, and I'm going to ask her a little bit about that today as well. She, as I said, is a practitioner. She's been on the Democratic National Committee for several decades. I won't say how many. And for 2 decades at Harvard, she was not only a lecturer, but the faculty advisor to the Innovations in Government program there that honored local and state innovations around the country. As I said, we're going to continue a conversation that we started in 1976 when we met on the Carter campaign, and I am going to ask her first, and this is a little break from the format, but we want Elaine to set the stage for the dialogue that we're going to have after. So, Elaine, welcome, and come tell us about 2022 and the parties.
Thank you, sweetie. Hello, everybody. Good morning, everyone, and I am pleased to be here. I sat through the morning. You had a wonderful morning of presenters, so I hope I can wrap things up a little bit. I'm going to spend a couple minutes just painting the picture of where American political parties are today, which is the picture of where politics is today. So let me start with an issue that, frankly, 30-some years ago when I was in graduate school in political science, I never anticipated. The Democratic Party has become the party of rich people. The Republican Party has become the party of poor people. This is a radical flip from the parties as they were from the 1930s, from the Depression, all the way up until most recently. A couple of statistics on this, okay? In both 2020 and 2018, and I expect it'll be the case 2022, if you take America's 3,000 counties and you divide them by counties where the GDP is above the national average and where the GDP is below the national average, guess what? Democrats win almost all the counties above the national average. Republicans win almost all the counties below the national average. This Democrats have had a hard time coming to terms with, right? As have Republicans in their own, each party in its own way. So Democrats occasionally let themselves do things like support an increase in the SALT tax. It's a state and local tax where it was capped at $10,000 a person. Most people, most houses in America, it's mostly real estate taxes, don't ever get to $10,000. But if you're living in New York or New Jersey or Massachusetts, man, you can be very middle class and your property taxes are still over $10,000. Fortunately, the Democrats pulled back from that as people said to them, hey, wait a minute, wait a minute. You're talking about people who are living in houses that are mansions in the rest of the country. So you can see the Democrats getting a little, their heads having to adjust to this new world. Same thing happens in the Republican Party. Okay, so the Republican Party was always the party of no government, and you had to work hard, and you had to support yourself, and you had to not have, not be reliant on government programs. Well, Donald Trump understood very well something about the new Republican Party, and the one thing he said that was really shocking to a lot of people is he wasn't going to touch anybody's Social Security, and he wasn't going to touch anybody's Medicare. Okay, and that was different than even Paul Ryan, who had been the speaker when Trump was coming in. In other words, Trump knew that his new base, the new base of the Republican Party, boy, oh boy, they needed that Social Security and that Medicare more than, ironically, those rich Democrats living in big cities and suburbs who were the traditional, supporters of those programs. So this class basis is new, really new, within the last kind of decade and a half, new, and is causing the parties a little bit of schizophrenia, each one of them. The racial differences, we've talked a little bit about in the morning. The African-American vote is still a solid Democratic vote. Every election time at this time, people say, oh, the African-Americans are taken advantage of, blah, 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 and yet African-American vote is still a solidly Democratic vote for pretty good reasons. The Hispanic vote is still a Democratic vote, but as we learned, there's huge variation within that vote, and that makes a difference state to state. So Venezuelans in Florida were a big issue, a big reason that Biden didn't do terribly well in 2020 in Florida, okay? And so this varies all over the place, and as is also the case with Asian American and Pacific Islanders, as we just heard. Overlaying these things is, and congruent with the difference in economics, the class difference, is a dramatic urban-rural split, okay? That's why when you look at a map of red states or counties by America, you go, wait a minute, how did Biden win that? Well, because in fact, vast sections of the country, thank God for our food production, and the world thanks us for our food production, but vast pieces of America are rural. And what has happened in this recent years is that rural areas have had enormous turnout. Back to our pollsters know that for years the model on predicting who would vote was rural voters were not very frequent voters. Donald Trump changed that. So we have seen rural counties voting 80-20 for the Republicans, just astonishing switch, which means that even though there's not a lot of people in those red counties, the fact is that they do deliver large segments of the vote for the Republican Party and therefore contribute to Republican strength. We also see a gender difference. Now, the gender gap in American politics appeared in the Reagan administration, so it appeared in 1980. And and women have tended to be more Democratic than men for decades now. And in fact, there's a lot of households in the country where they just admit it. The husband votes Republican, the wife votes Democratic. That's it. They seem to get along just fine. But what happens when it matters is that there's the men don't counteract the women, or the women don't counteract the men. That, in other words, there's a lot more women voting for the Democrats, and the men are not voting for the Republicans in the same portions, right? So it doesn't even out. And sort of confounding this is that, this is my pet peeve with most political analysts and commentators, is they tend to talk about blacks, Hispanics, and women. Now, the problem there is that African Americans are between 11 and 13% of the population, Hispanics by 18, 20%, depending, and women are 52% of the population, and they vote more than men do. So a small change, a small percentage change in the female vote can have enormous consequences in the vote for a senator or a governor or a president, which we have seen. If you combine that with the swing areas of the country, which tend to be the suburbs, what you find is in a lot of races recently, we're looking at white suburban women. Where are they going to go? That's probably one of our best indicators of what's going to happen in an election. And finally, we have age differences. Okay, so young people starting in 2008 were much more Democratic than their older cohorts. If in fact no one under 30 had voted in 2008, Obama would not have been elected. That's how profoundly different the millennial generation is. The millennials are now moving into their later 30s, which means that they only vote more frequently than they did when they were younger. And what we know from long years of data on political socialization is that early party identification tends to stick. It tends to stick. We have unusual issues. My dad was a Depression baby. All those Depression people, most of whom are dead now, like my dad, most of those people voted Democratic their whole life. Their first vote was Roosevelt, and that's who they voted for. My dad diverged from this once when he voted for Nixon over McGovern because, as he said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, they left me, which we've heard. So there are changes in that, but by and large, party identification does hold on throughout a person's lifetime. So that's a picture of the parties right now. The other picture that I think is as important is the intra-party divisions. Because remember, Europeans often wonder, well, how do you do this? There's just two parties, et cetera. Well, really, if we were a parliamentary system, we'd have 5 or 6 parties, because each party has huge factions within it. This election is going to tell us a lot about what is the Trump faction like in the Republican Party. How powerful is it? Can Trump alone pull a very poor candidate like Herschel Walker across the line and win that Senate seat? Okay, people are going to be looking, I think, first and foremost at the Trump equation to tell how powerful is that faction in his party. Similarly, on the Democratic side, people will be looking at what I'd call the Bernie faction. Okay, the far left faction. We know already from our research on primaries, and Brookings, by the way, has done a lot of research on primaries, that the far left faction in the Democratic Party was considerably weaker within the Democratic Party than the Trump faction was within the Republican Party. Trump played in a lot more races. He won a lot more races. Bernie, AOC, for all the attention they get, played in very few races. They only won 50% of those. They were really very minor actors in the Democratic primary this time. The press would lead you to believe that that's not the case because the press love equivalency, right? But in this instance, we have data to show that there wasn't any equivalency. So what's going to happen in the future? Okay, as you heard, right, the Democrats peaked after Labor Day. We then have had several weeks of, oh my God, the Republicans are going to win everything. And now if somebody tells you that they know what's going to happen on next Tuesday, just don't believe them because nobody knows. I mean, it's just impossible to know. But we can look at some very longer term trends. One of them is that people don't quite understand is that states change their partisan makeup as their demographic makeup changes. So when I was a young undergraduate studying political science, one of the first things we learned about presidential elections was that Vermont was a rock rib Republican state. Vermont solidly voted Republican. In fact, Vermont was so Republican, it was the only state in the Union that didn't vote for Franklin Roosevelt in the huge sweep of 1932. Well, now Vermont has the only socialist, democratic socialist, we've ever had. It's not. Now, why is that? Did Vermonters suddenly change their minds? No. A bunch of people from the west side of New York moved to Vermont because they thought it was really cool, which it's a cool place to live. So they moved and they brought their politics with them. Flip side of that example, look at Georgia. Linda's home now. Georgia has always been a deep South, solidly Democratic state. Blue Dog Democrats came from Georgia, and then it changed. It became more Republican. Now, why? The common answer is civil rights, and that did have an impact. But there's another deeper answer, which is that Georgia began in the 70s and 80s to have an economy that looked more like the economy of other big states. Atlanta exploded. And when that happened in the 70s and the 80s, businesses relocated to Atlanta. Did native Georgians suddenly change their politics? No. People moved into the state who were Republicans and gave that a much more business-oriented Republican feel. Now, as we fast forward about 40, 50 years, what's happening in Georgia? Well, to everybody's surprise and to the delight of the Democrats, Biden carried the state, and they have 2 Democratic senators, which is sort of stunning. 2 Democratic senators. Why? Well, Atlanta. Okay? Atlanta looks more like a big city in the Northeast than it does like a city in the Old South. And that change, which is an in-migration change, is responsible for this. Tennessee, where when I worked for Al Gore, we used to get, weekly missives from Tennessee, and we could see it happening. Tennessee's black population was shrinking, and guess what was happening? People who homeschooled their children were migrating to Tennessee. They were Christians, Christian evangelicals, wanted to homeschool. If you homeschool your children, you want to live near other people who do that so your children can have sports and a social life, etc. And lo and behold, as that happened, the state got more and more Republican, one of the more Republican states we have now in the Union. So the states do change. And when the states change for other reasons, for lifestyle reasons, etc., their partisan affiliation tends to change, which is why we've got an Arizona, a Georgia, places like that where we just can't call the election. We just can't call the election because there's so many forces, one side and the other. My colleagues and I have a long-running, email chain. One of them calls himself the bedwetter because he only takes bad news, right? And he only puts bad news out. I call myself the eternal optimist because I find the good news and put only the good news there. And having done that for like 3 months now in the run-up to this election, I'll tell you, it is really hard to call this one. So that's why we come to this election itself and the issue of participation. We know right now that the early vote and the absentee vote are on par with the early and absentee vote of 2018. It is a huge vote. We also know that more Democrats have voted than Republicans early, but it's surprising, it's not by large numbers. There's, in spite of the Republican propaganda against absentee ballots and claiming that they're all fraudulent, et cetera, there's loads of Republicans voting absentee and voting early. In some states, Pennsylvania being one of them, the Democratic early vote is much bigger than the Republican early vote, which might be a good omen for Fetterman, I don't know. But the bottom line is we are headed towards a very high participation turnout. 2018 was the highest midterm turnout in 40 years. And this midterm could in fact exceed that. So with that, let me just say that there are, the issues are pretty obvious. They're the economy. But we've got one issue that we can't really tell about, and that's abortion. We've never had an issue like abortion. First of all, abortion is, people feel intensely about it. Secondly, on abortion, there's a clear difference between the parties. Very clear difference. The Republicans are no, the Democrats are yes. No mistaking that. Unlike, say, inflation, where if you're a Democrat, you'll tend to say, yeah, inflation is terrible, it's a big issue, but that Joe Biden, he's doing all he can. It's the fault of corporations, and they're raising their prices, and they're irresponsible. If you're a Republican, you say, it's all Joe Biden's fault, and it's the fault of those Democrats who passed through that big, stimulus package that caused the inflation, et cetera. Abortion, you can't do that. And so I would say that the one big question mark I have about this election is what is the turnout level, and how does this abortion issue play? People don't talk about abortion. We just heard in our last panel, I think it was Laura, who said that the men in her focus groups just didn't even want to answer the question. They just turned to the women and said the women. There could be, and this could help the Democrats, there could be a lot of men who turn to their wives or their girlfriends and say, so what do I do on this? And they say, vote Democratic. Or it could be an issue that gets swamped by economics, which is what most conventional wisdom is now. But I'm just laying down this marker. Watch the abortion issue in this race, and watch the participation and the turnout, particularly in these brand new states that seem to be changing their partisanship. Arizona, Georgia are the ones that really come to mind. So with that, I will sit down and talk to Linda, as I've been doing for 40 years, and take your questions.
Well, thanks. Always. We learn something from you. I had mentioned to Elaine that the conversation we've been having for 40 years is how important is communication in governing and in politics. And as a political scientist, she has one opinion, and as a communicator, both practitioner and scholar, I obviously have a different opinion. And so for 40 years we've talked about, okay, how important is message? How important is communication? How important is the way that you try to reach voters through the ideas that your party has? And so we thought we would start with a little bit of political communication, presidential communication theory, and break down Jeremy Mayer's alchemy of presidential image. the 4 parts of it, and have Elaine react to where we are right now with those 4 parts. So, as most of you know, Jeremy Mayer, at the turn of the 21st century, said there are 4 things that create a president's image. And since a president's image is important in midterms as well as in the presidential election, let's look at that. So, the first thing he says is the president's character, his actions, and his ability to communicate. The second thing he says is the president's team and staff and their ability to create a narrative. The third thing is the opponents, the president's opponents, and how effective are they at putting out a counter narrative. And then the fourth thing is, and this was pre-social media, he called it the cacophony of media voices that are creating that mediated reality. So let's start with the presidency, okay? There's this theory of presidential communication called the rhetorical presidency. It's committed to words. Jameson and Toulis and Hart all talked about the words the president used. It's reflected in long op-eds or in long speeches or in sit-down TV interviews. And President Biden seems to be stuck in the rhetorical presidency. His staff has actually complained that he and the baby boomers around him seem not to understand that we've moved to what Josh Sacco calls the ubiquitous presidency, which Zelensky and Trump and others are so good at. So, what happened? I mean, they knew how to put together a convention, they knew how to put together an inauguration, and then they seem to have been flat-footed all the way through 2021 and 2022. What would you have liked to see come out of the White House? And is the staff to blame, or is it Biden?
Oh, I think it's mostly Biden. And I think it's a combination of, it's 2 different things. So you have Biden, who is of a different generation. Okay, Biden is just, you know, an old guy. He's not demented or any of that nonsense that people would have you believe, but he is of a different generation. He believes in policy. He thinks that he can negotiate with Republicans. He's been slow to understand that a piece of the Republican Party has gone simply off the rails and believe in a lot of conspiracy theories and stuff like that. So a lot of that is Biden himself. The other problem is that his staff is of a radically different generation. And if you look at the people in the White House, they're very young. They're overwhelmingly people of color. They come from the Northeast, all right? They come from deep blue states. They have never met a Republican. They have never met an evangelical Christian. Okay, they have never met anybody who thinks that there's something really weird and wrong with giving people operations to change their gender. Okay, they come from a world where they've been in a bubble, and that makes a lot of these young people, and I've heard people complain about this on the Hill staffs too, not able to understand when they're walking into traps that kill them in the rest of the country. And we saw that with defund the police. Defund the police, according to Jim Clyburn, in the third ranking in the House, cost the Democrats 14 seats in 2020. Defund the police is likely to cost the Democrats a bunch of other seats. Now, I will tell you that we at Brookings, we have a scholar who's an expert on criminology, an African-American, very esteemed sociologist. He wrote a wonderful piece about this, okay? The origin of that was not really to take away money from the police, but it was to move some money to social workers and people like this to for instance, get the drunk off the subway steps, right? Right now, the police have to take the drunk who's passed out on the subway steps or the drug addict, and the police do it. What they really meant was let the police find criminals. Let them find bad guys. So if we go to Frank Luntz, okay,
Yes.
who's a hero of mine and Linda's for his absolute ability to communicate, if Frank Luntz had seen that policy, he would have called it something like free up the police to fight the bad guys. Right? And stop having the policemen, you know, do these sort of public order kinds of things. Yeah. And so that's where, you know, that's one of the big issues here, is a sort of generational problem.
Well, a generational problem that, as you have pointed out, played into the president's opponents, which is the third part of Mayor's formula. The president's opponents being able, in this case, to take the words of Democrats and run against them on that. For those of you who don't know, and there may be, I think most of the people in the room know who Frank Luntz is, but he wrote a book called Words Matter. He was known as Dan Quayle's brain, I'm sorry, not Dan Quayle, he's known as Newt Gingrich's brain. He is the person who came up with the idea of contract with America that gave the Republicans the House for the first time in 40 years. And he is the person who is known for changing the estate tax to having Republicans talk about it as a death tax. So he is focused on words. And we have said, Elaine and I have talked many times, that the Democrats need a Frank Luntz. So maybe somebody in this room would like to step up and help the Democrats. Well, okay, so let's talk about how the Republican Party has, over the years, done what Chris Matthews said this morning on Morning Joe. And Chris Matthews, we've known him from politics. You know him from his MSNBC show that he no longer has. But Chris, who wrote a book called Hardball, said again this morning, as he said for many years, that the American voter only can absorb 3 ideas. And that when you're running a campaign, you need to run it on 3 ideas. So talk about the Republicans and their 3 ideas and how clear they've been, and the Democrats and what you think their 3 ideas are and how clear they've been.
Well, just a little bit of history here. The archetype of that was the 1972 Republican presidential campaign, where they had 3 very simple ideas. The Democrats were for acid, abortion, and amnesty. 3 hot button issues. The Democrats were a bunch of hippies who were taking LSD. They were for everybody having abortions, and they were for letting in lots of people into the country and giving them amnesty, okay? The Republicans established in 1972, they were really good at this, okay? They were really good at picking on the Democrats' weak points. And the Democrats were no damn good at fighting back. The only one who has been was Bill Clinton in 1992. Bill Clinton had, in the 1992 primaries, what has become famous as a Sister Souljah moment. Sister Souljah was a rapper who was rapping about killing white people. And rather than sort of ignoring this and saying, oh, that's on the fringe, et cetera, which is most Democrats did, Bill Clinton stepped up to the plate and said, no, that's wrong. Okay, that is wrong. It's as wrong to rap about killing white people as it is to rap about killing black people or Asians or anybody else. Wrong. That signaled to America that he was a different kind of Democrat. And that signaling was critical. No Democrat has been able to do that yet. Biden didn't, it wasn't, Biden, this is sort of going a little bit around this question, Linda, but Biden himself ran as somebody who was simply competent. He was an old white guy who knew how to make things happen, right? And people voted for him because, let's face it, Trump as president was very exciting, but he was a little bit shambolic. Okay, shambolic is a British slang term, which I've just picked up, and is absolutely descriptive of, sort of the on and off policy changes and confusion that surrounded much of the Trump presidency. So Biden looked good, and people switched and they voted for Joe Biden. The problem Joe Biden had was he was elected for competence, and the very first thing and he was doing okay when he got shots into people's arms. That seemed to be okay. And then Afghanistan happened. And Afghanistan looked like a great, big, incompetent mess. And it took his sole raison d'etre. Because let's face it, Joe Biden isn't charismatic. He isn't a great wordsmith. He is not a great communicator at all. But he was elected for competence. So first you have Afghanistan. Then you have a resurgence of the virus, which they prematurely declared was over. And then you have inflation that is not a temporary glitch because people thought, because of the supply chains and stuff like that. It's a long-running, big, big problem. So all of a sudden, the raison d'etre for Biden disappears. And there's no amount of, because the raison d'etre for Biden was based on performance, not words, there's no amount of words that Biden can do. Could he have messaged inflation better? Yeah, maybe, but inflation is like a real thing. You can't get around it by talking. The gas prices are right there for everybody to see. So there's limits to, even if you have a good communicator, there's real limits to what they can do in the face of some pretty big policy problems.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. That fourth part of Jeremy Mayer's alchemy of presidential image is what he called the cacophony of media voices, right? Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, that means a whole lot more 20 years on from his first work. We saw it last week, I should say, or earlier this week, with the way that the new information ecosystem abhors a vacuum, and how before the facts could get out, the disinformation network went to work on the Paul Pelosi attack.
Exactly.
How do you, as a political scientist, how do you see this ecosystem as it's changed, the information ecosystem? How has it affected politics, and how do you see it playing out in the midterms, the disinformation that's out there?
Well, I think it's very dangerous because it causes people to think that the stakes are much higher than they are. Okay, so someone told me last night at the reception, who'd been having this conversation with MAGA supporters, that they thought that Nancy Pelosi was planning on having concentration camps for people who didn't agree with her. Now, I said, what? I mean, what shred of evidence is there for that? And by the way, the Democrats think that, a lot of Democrats think that Donald Trump is going to dismantle the Republican, become a dictator. Okay, so you've got what's happened with this is that as the ecosystem gets less reliant on facts and more reliant on people coming up with, fantastical interpretations, people then decide that, boy, there's a lot at stake, and what is at stake is worth fighting for. So that's why you get the guy in 2016 who went into this poor pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. with a gun, ready to shoot him up because he got convinced that in the basement of the pizza parlor, Nancy Pelosi was holding children and selling them for sex. Now, this was kind of a nutty idea, but somebody believed it, and the somebody who believed it had a gun. Not to mention...
Let me jump in there and ask you, so as a political scientist looking at what's happening right now, how near do you think we are to violence around the elections coming up?
We are, it's clear that we are close to violence around the election. It's clear that there will be polling places. Just recently in Arizona, a court stepped in to forbid a radical group who was standing around ballot boxes dressed in fatigues, bearing arms, okay, and videotaping people who came to vote. And the court said, no, you can't do that, you're violating the 75 feet away, et cetera. I think there will be some violence at ballot boxes. I think there'll be some violence at election counting places. I do think the secretaries of state have not been, going back to communicating as well as they should. You know, every single county in the United States, when they count those absentee ballots, has a representative from the Republican Party and a representative from the Democratic Party in the room. In the room. These guys are armed with depositions. The courts are ready. You go to court right away if you see something funny happen. And you know, well, guess what? People think that somehow these election administrators are doing this all by themselves with no one watching. People are watching, okay? The Democratic Party and the Republican Party in a presidential year mobilize tens of thousands of lawyers. And the lawyers are ready, they take depositions, and they rush to court on election day. So it's not like there's nobody watching the vote counters. There's two big political parties, and they're watching the vote counters because this is part of what they do.
Well,
that's their job.
I'm sure we'll make it a question on Steve Bannon and his precinct strategy, but I'm going to go to the audience. Questions for Elaine, either about the parties or about her views of communication from the parties? Yes.
So over time, there have been a few JOP players.
Oh, okay.
Hello. JOP players that have been more influential than others. For example, it's not uncommon to hear the Republican Party being referred as the Reagan Party. So my question is, looking forward, does Trump carry the strength to be as revolutionary to make it over time Trump's party, or is he just an exception or a disruption?
I think it is Trump's party right now. I think there's no doubt about it. We saw that in the primaries. But there's a couple of questions. How does Trump's party do in contested races? We don't know. We won't know that till next Tuesday, or maybe beyond if they spend a long time counting the votes. That will be a test. And then remember that Trump is facing the exact same problem Biden is facing. He's old. People know he's old, right? Can't really hide being old. And there are a lot of people, like the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who are younger, who want to take up the mantle. So my guess is that if he runs for president in 2024, he will get a primary challenge. And the question is, what's the distribution of that primary field? I think Mike Pence is going to run. I think Mike Pence is going to run as if you like Trump's policies, if you want to be tough on the border, you want to have a Christian country, et cetera, but you don't like Trump's nuttiness and criminal, problems, vote for me. That's the Mike Pence candidacy. I think you'll have a Ron DeSantis candidacy that says, I'm like Trump, but I'm more competent, I can actually get these things done in a way that Trump couldn't, and I'm younger and I'm more energetic. So I think you'll see a challenge to Trump in the primary. I don't think it's automatic that Trump wins that Republican primary. I mean, he and Pence, in a variety of these congressional races, and Senate races, he and Pence endorsed opposing candidates. Okay, so there is a non-Trump Republican Party out there. On policy, it looks a lot like Trump. Okay, but on sort of the affect, if you will, the emotion, right? It's a bit different from Trump. So we'll know a lot better after Tuesday, but time has a way of sorting these things out.
Well, I want to follow up on that. So you have written that Liz Cheney could still run for president. So
Right.
can you talk about that a little bit, and then we'll go back to questions.
Well, I've sort of changed my mind on that, okay?
all right.
I did
We
say
hadn't had that conversation
Yes,
yet.
we haven't had that conversation. My feeling is that there will be one non-Trump candidate, and that Cheney has just moved too far in her, you know, in her movements in the House, just moved too far away from the Republican base. People don't like being told, "Hey, you're a dummy." You got hornsmuggled by this guy. He's a crook. He's a criminal. He's going to jail. Blah blah. They don't like being told that, which is why, and this is very controversial in Washington, which is why I keep saying watch Pence. Because what does Pence do? Pence is on the trail where he consistently talks about the Trump-Pence record, right? He talks about what they did in the White House and why you should love what they did in the White House, etc. But, you know, doesn't have he's not under investigation by 6 courts or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? And by the way, Republicans I know who know these people personally, they love Mike Pence. They think he's a truly, genuinely nice human being and a very good man. So that's why I think that Pence could be, this could be a very interesting first vice president to run against his president. This could be a very interesting race. But I do think Liz Cheney has gone too far.
Another question. Yes, in the back there.
First of all, I agree with you, Professor, about Mike Pence. I've thought of that for about over a year now. I think the Democrats have to be really worried about if he wins the primary and gets the nomination. I think he'll be a harder battle for Biden against Trump. But to my question, I've been really mulling over this issue of the violence and looking at it related to communication and media, particularly if we look at social media and we look at how individuals are using social media pretty much it's the way to communicate or through technology. And the issue of disinformation, misinformation, as well as misrepresentation that is occurring at exacerbating rates on a daily basis, and how people are making decisions about what they're going to do and how they're going to do with their politics. Now we can see this with their insurrection that occurred, or the attempted insurrection that occurred on January 6th. We can see this with Mr. Pelosi and his treatment afterwards, as well as the Speaker's treatment as well. And these, I don't really think they're really so much fringe groups. I think they're part of the American experience, which is these white supremacist groups, these Aryan groups that were predominantly a part of January 6th, or that have militarized themselves and are part of this violent movement to shift democracy or change the country's narrative regarding democracy in a significant way. And I don't think they're going anywhere. So my question is, if you see some violence moving forward with the election, how do you see that progressing in time, especially in relationship to the disinformation, the misinformation, and the misrepresentation that is occurring on social media sites, and that being the predominant way people are gaining their information as well as organizing themselves politically as well as socially?
Well, you've got to go to law enforcement, right? You've got to go to law enforcement. I'll tell you an experience we had here in Washington, D.C. January 6th happened, everybody was appalled, it was frightening, etc. And then the internet started having this rumor saying, we're coming back on March the 4th. And we're going to take over on March the 4th. March the 4th used to be the date on which presidents were inaugurated. Okay, so they picked that date, and they were going to come back, and they were going to inaugurate, you know, Donald Trump then. Well, so Washington got ready, right? I mean, you couldn't drive any place, right? Streets were blocked off. There was wire around the Capitol. There were National Guard all over the place, called in from Virginia and Maryland, et cetera. We were ready. March 4th came. March 4th when? No one showed up. No one. Now, what happened between January 6th and March 4th? People who bought into the fantasy, right, discovered that the FBI was knocking at their door. They discovered that they had to get a lawyer. They discovered that, oh my God, they might lose their job because of this, and that lawyers cost a lot of money. Nobody likes to have to hire a lawyer. So all of that happened. In other words, people had a little dose of reality. No, Joe Biden was president. What you did when you broke the glass in the Capitol to get into the building was, in fact, a violation of 10 different laws, okay? And there is law, and there is the ability to enforce law. As long as we have the ability to enforce the law, people will be found out, they'll be prosecuted, and they'll be put in jail. And that is what's happening right now. Everybody complains, oh, it's taking so long. Well, of course it should take a long time. The judicial system should be, thorough. But people are going to jail. And that has a dampening effect. So you'll still have the lone actors, like, clearly the guy who broke into the Pelosi home was really mentally unbalanced, in addition to feeding on all this, hate stuff. He was clearly mentally unbalanced. We are going to have that. We have that with school shootings. We have a lot of random violence in the United States. But the level of organization that I think some people on January 6th thought they were going to have, I don't think we're going to have it.
Okay, we have time for one short question. Yes, right there.
Going back to, you said to watch the abortion issue, what I saw and experienced myself was just a lot of lack of, sudden loss of trust. We've been talking a little bit about the Democrats sort of lacking the ability to follow through. And I saw a lot of people losing trust in the Democrats when they had the opportunity to codify Roe, and then it was leaked and they had the opportunity to do something about it, and then we lost it. And you talk about how there is, abortion is going to be a big issue here. I was wondering how that factors in when clearly voters can't go to the Republicans, but now there's a lot of lost trust in the Democrats with the abortion issue.
Okay, well, two things about it. At no point since 1972 did the Democrats have a filibuster-proof margin in the Senate. So passing a law to, federal law to outlaw abortion was impossible.
Codify.
Codify, I'm sorry. So it was impossible. So that's why the Democrats didn't do it. They weren't going to make people, they weren't going to put this out there.
They didn't have the votes.
They just didn't have the votes. So they went on to other things. The judiciary is where this has settled, and one of the unknown facts about Joe Biden is that he has confirmed more federal judges at this point in his tenure than any other modern president. So in other words, what he's doing is, having learned from the way the court has gone, is that he's flooding the lower federal offices with Democratic judges. Whether or not the people have lost trust in the Democrats because of this, I can't really speak to that. I don't really know. What I do know is there is no alternative, right? There is no alternative. If this is the issue you care about, you have to vote for Democrats. There isn't a
But I want to jump in there. So why have the Democrats not been able to make that message, and why have they not been able to make the threat to democracy message stick?
But they have. It shows up in the polls. Abortion and threat to democracy, they show up in the top 4 all the time. And if you look at Democratic Senate ads, they're all about choice. Here in Washington, or for those of you who are visiting, you'll see these ads against Yesli Vega. It's all about choice. So Democrats are pounding this. So, the question is not going to be that the Democrats haven't articulated this. The issue is going to be, do people place inflation more importantly? Right? That's going to be where it is. People have made the message.
Well, we're going to agree to disagree on whether or not the Democrats have made that message, and we're going to thank Elaine for being with us today.